Welcome to the second part of the GSSB meeting on the 20th of September 2017 in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. My name is Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator at GRI Governance Relations. I'm going to proceed to a roll call for the second part of the meeting. We have on the line Daniel Taillant.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Mr. Daniel Ingram.
Present.
Mr. Ken Swift.
Present.
Mr. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Mr. Vadikapatnan Kumar.
Present.
Mr. Michel Washer.
Present.
Miss Julia Wilson.
Present.
Mr. Stian van Draag.
Present.
Miss Robin Leeson.
Present.
Miss Kirstine Harvey.
Present.
Mr. Attila Yarlikaya.
Present.
Miss Sulema Pioli.
Present.
Mr. Jürgen Buxbaum.
Present.
Thank you. I'd like to underline the presence of GRI Secretariat staff Bastien Buck, as well as Miss Chiara Ferraccioli. And I will now hand it over to Judy Kuzeski, Chair of the GSSB, to continue with this meeting.
Thank you, Pamela. Welcome back, everyone. And I would like to start by thanking GRI Chief Executive Tim Mohin, who is very generously spending some time with us down the line from New York at the moment to help us discuss the GSSB work program going forward. Both the present priorities and the work program going forward. The purpose of this is to gain a better understanding of the GRI Secretariat views as to GRI strategy and how they may be supported or enhanced better by the activity of the GSSB and how we can deploy our work plan and our strategy on behalf of the standards to support the wider strategy of GRI appropriately. Tim, I believe you have some slides that you would like to talk us through.
No, I don't. I don't have any slides.
So it's the input to GSSB work program, which keep going.
Yeah, I was just going to talk it through without slides, if that's okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Judy. Thank you to the GSSB board members and to the public listening in. I just want to briefly cover some of the activities in the Secretariat and how they may affect the GSSB and Standards Division work plan. So had a really good session with our board of directors as well as GSSB, covering at a high level our strategic refresh. And I emphasize the word refresh in that GRI has had a good strategy and has been moving forward and successful for quite a long time. In fact, it's our 20th anniversary year just now. The refresh has four focus areas. The first is being our standards themselves, which I think is our core product, and we intend to continue to invest and expand that area. The second is our harmonization activities to try and work with other standard setters as well as frameworks to make sure that the reporting markets see some harmonization and alignment to reduce the amount of confusion and therefore increase our efficiency and thus our effectiveness. The third and the fourth area are to reduce reporting burden, working with the organizations that are reporting now to understand their needs. And then the last area is to work with the consumers of the information, investors, civil society, company employees, and directors to help them understand their needs and help to format the reporting so that it actually meets their needs. So those are the basic strategies that we have at a very high level. that we've gone through with GSSB today. The specifics that impact the GSSB in particular, there are three. Reporting quality is one, and we'll talk about each one of these. The second is the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm here in New York talking about those with many of the stakeholders here. And the third is some of the emerging issues that are popping up quite rapidly in the area of transparency. So with that, Judy, I'm just going to plow ahead if that's okay with you.
Please do.
Okay. So first on reporting quality, I think that we need to take a step back and look at the context of reporting quality rather than just get into sort of the nuances of assurance. We know through some research that reporting quality increases the reliance of consumers of this information. And if the consumers or decision makers are feeling comfortable, they can rely on the information, then of course they will make decisions based on that information. And we have seen, poor quality reports across the board as we've looked at them, and we do think that there is an issue here to be solved. We note also there's several developments in the standards setting space for developing assurance standards or assurance guidance for ESG disclosures. AICPA in the US has just recently introduced some guidance for attestation agreements. The international, the IAASB is also considering such standards or guidance for assuring ESG disclosures. So we think this is an important aspect to our theory of change, which is that disclosure leads to decisions which lead to improvement. And so I think it's something that GRI is very interested in and should look into. And I think there's a strong component that impacts our standards division. So that's item one. Item two, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is perhaps one of the most important developments, in generations with regard to sustainable development. We have the entire world, the unanimous vote by the UN, all 193 countries, behind Agenda 2030, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So companies and institutions and organizations across the world are now trying to understand what does that mean and how do they identify their impacts and contributions to the SDGs and therefore report on them. I'm very happy to say that GRI is a leader in the space of providing advice to companies and organizations on how to identify their impacts to the SDGs and report on them. And tomorrow we'll be in the UN introducing a report that we co-authored with the UN Global Compact, UNGC, which will provide that guidance to reporters, not just on how to report, but what to do to improve their performance on the Sustainable Development Goals and the 169 targets that are under each goal. And so that is an important piece of work, and I think it's something that the GSSB should examine and take seriously as you look at your new work products, because that is the world's formatting now for sustainable development, and I think we have to be very sensitive to that. How would it affect you specifically? As we've looked at the disclosure standards that are relevant to the 169 targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, we've identified some gaps. Those gaps, I think, are very important to understand and potentially fill as companies and organizations across the world try to report on their contribution to the SDGs. We've also identified the opposite of gaps. We found in several cases that there are numerous disclosure standards that relate to a single goal and target, and that has created quite a bit of confusion. So in some areas we have gap filling, in other areas we have alignment work that I think needs to be done in order to meet our obligations under the SDGs. The third area is emerging issues. We have seen throughout the world lots of policies on specific sustainability issues be promulgated that are related to transparency. The UK Modern Slavery Act, the Conflict Minerals Rule, and others all specifically require companies to publish reports publicly about what they've done to identify and eradicate those issues in their supply chains. And so we're seeing a lot of new transparency requirements, and yet there's no disclosure standards with regard to those requirements. And so we have been working to identify them and to see whether or not GRI at the secretariat level could play a role to assist companies who are struggling with these issues on some consistent guidance on how to report on those issues. And we think that this would be quite helpful as those standards start to take shape, to provide some of the pre-work, if you will, with companies and civil society players on what a consistent set of reporting guidance would look like. And eventually down the road, should the GSSB decide to take those up, I think a lot of that work will be already done and make the system and process go much faster. So those are the three areas that we see as possible inputs to the GSSB work plan. I'll pause there and see if there are questions.
Right. Any discussion among the GSSB members around the general points of input that Tim has put to us? This has to do with the report quality area, the SDGs, and the emerging issues guidance. Tim, maybe could I ask you to give us a little bit of advice about how you would like the GSSB to respond or feed back to this input? What do you think would be the most useful thing for us to do at this stage?
Well, I think it's a discussion. There's always more work than we have time or budget to do. So I'm giving you some input on what I think are the priorities from what I see in my perch. But I think obviously the GSSB has a different perch and a different role. And you need to think through, how do these priorities relate to the priorities you're already considering? And I think that's the discussion we need to have.
Would any members like to offer a conversation starter with respect to that point, how we sort of bring together our work plan process with some of the feedback that we get from the Secretariat? That's obviously an important source of feedback for us and a source of information for us to take into consideration. And of course, tomorrow we have a number of different discussions about our work plan, both the immediate priorities and future projects that we would like to be considering. Any thoughts with respect to how we can take this forward? Julia.
Well, I think regarding what you said, Tim, about things like the UK Modern Slavery Act or other regulatory requirements, I mean, we want to be careful that we keep a line there, but if, to the extent that GRI, Tim or other folks on the GRI team get, knowledge of coming regulation or, understanding of what certain governments are looking for from a reporting requirement, certainly that would change the work plan if something were to come up that maybe GRI could create or update a standard for, that would be relevant for a regulatory or kind of governmental requirement.
That's an excellent point. We do have, I think, an excellent policy team that is tracking policy developments across the world, not only on these issue-specific items that we just discussed, but across the more generic reporting policies where stock exchanges and regulators are saying that companies have to disclose ESG information and are often putting GRI as one of the standards that they can use to do so. So if that's of interest to the GSSB, we'd be happy to provide it.
Okay. Kirsten.
Yes, while I'm a bit reluctant to to develop a standard, a GRI standard to comply with a national regulation. I think the national regulations are important input to our standard setting process. And the other way, it's also possible to show how the GRI standards can be used to comply with certain national or international regulations.
I think that's a very important point, and I want to be clear that, in my view anyway, there's never been a time, and I don't see a time coming, where GRI can be used to reply for compliance with issues specific, like conflict minerals. That's being done between companies and governments, and that won't change. However, using the conflict minerals example, companies across the planet are reporting on their efforts to identify and eradicate conflict in their supply chains. That goes over and above what they're actually disclosing to governments for compliance. It's that area that we're trying to address, because it's kind of like all over the map right now, and we're working with OECD and other organizations to try to harmonize what companies are reporting in the effort to get more companies to step up and start to work on these issues. But it's just to be very, very clear, it's not to step in between governments and industry in terms of compliance.
Yeah, this is Bastian. Just maybe to help also bridge the conversations that we had on work program and Tim's input. I think for report quality, that has been, as several of you mentioned, a reoccurring subject in the discussions of the GSSB. And it is now really the next step to take stock of the international developments, and there is probably also a discussion on the role that we want to play in being a part of these international developments. So that's an actionable item in many ways, also for the discussions tomorrow. For the SDGs, one of Tim was alluding to the project that GRI has run with the UN Global Compact. And one of the key outcomes is currently that mapping exercise, identifying gaps and those areas where other frameworks have developed contents already that are not yet part of the GRI standards. So I think you've anticipated a lot of this work in setting out priorities around economic related issues and human rights, which are probably reflective of a fair share, if not the lion's share of the SDG ambition set out in the global goals. But it is, going forward, a very interesting discussion, and we have the commitment of Tim to come back to the GSB with more of the detail of which gaps exactly are the most pressing ones. That would enable us to also steer the project groups that we will be commissioning on economic related issues and human rights in the right direction. So any input that can come through the UNGC and GI project will be very much welcomed. On the last item, and that I think is actually probably the link between the SDGs and the emerging issues. Most of the emerging issues that we're currently not covering in GI are sector specific, or they are for a subset of sectors. And maybe some of them become actually more relevant to very many sectors. But the nature of it is usually with the emerging issues that they have a certain specificity for it that we weren't able to address. So that's a discussion we will pick up tomorrow that we had, Tim, earlier today as well, and that call from very different stakeholder groups and the emergence of that notion of sector-specific guidance as a gap in our offering. That's something that has been discussed at the GSB, that we brought to the attention of the GSB in the briefings earlier today, and that you are bringing back to the table, so we can also discuss that further tomorrow. Thank you.
Tim, this is Judy. I think maybe one thing that I'd like to hear a little bit more about with respect to the reporting quality discussion. Because we have here a kind of live debate with a number of different organizations opening up discussion and research and development programs around this topic, and we have a sort of a proposal that you have made to us, Tim, that that GRI contributes to the development of, or in itself develops, an internationally accepted assurance standard for sustainability reports. I think one of the questions that I would have for you is about the role of the GSSB, given that we have a kind of simultaneous set of processes here that are being driven by other organizations. How would you like the GSSB to sort of organize its thinking around that particular activity?
Yeah, great question. I think it starts with the very end goal in mind. If the GSSB believes that quality of reporting is important, if that's the case, then I think go through the process of looking at, well, is quality a problem? And if we agree that there are some problems with quality, then how do we solve it? Once we get to that position, and I hope you're there, that you see that there's a number of international standards setting activities and some national standard setting activities with regard to assurance that I think are quite important. My proposal or my thought for the GSSB would be not to duplicate anything that's already out there from the professionals working in this area, but to join with them and to provide guidance from GRI and GSSB perspective on how those assurance standards could represent GRI reference reports. As the highest adoption rate of any sustainability disclosure standard, I think it would be very important for those assurance standard providers to understand and make sure that GRI disclosures are represented in what they produce. So that would be my thought to you. It's not to duplicate anybody's work, but to join with those other organizations, internationally recognized organizations that are developing assurance standards for ESG disclosure.
Okay, thank you. Any other members with questions or observations? Tim, as you've said, you're in New York right now during UN General Assembly Week, and there's a great deal of discussion of the global goals, the SDGs. We know that this has been the subject of not just GRI's efforts, but many different organizations to kind of comprehend the business role with respect to the SDGs. And following on from that, we would do well, I think, to look at how the GRI standards help to ensure that the SDGs are implemented and attained on some level through the mechanism of sustainability reporting and disclosure and use of information. I think there are lots of different questions that we'll need to get into with respect to our work program around how this actually gets plugged in. Is it a kind of standard by standard basis? Are there overarching guidance materials that need to be developed? If so, by whom? All of these sorts of practical questions. And also, what's the scope of guidance or requirements that GRI might be able to set, given the range of how the SDGs are organized and framed. So we rather quickly get into a lot of very detailed discussion around that. But this is something that I know is being explored on the Secretariat side as well. So I think that we'd be very grateful to see the results and also just the interim findings of any of your investigations in that direction.
Yeah, so let me start out by responding with this. Of the three areas we've talked about, this one, in my view, is the highest priority. It's really, really clear that the entire world is moving in this direction, and that if our efforts are continuing to be relevant, they also must move in this direction. The good news is that GRI is a leader in evaluating how disclosures will be done with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. As I mentioned, we will be releasing a report in conjunction with our partner UN Global Compact here in New York tomorrow. That report sets out the disclosures required for each one of the 169 targets. And I think that there is quite a bit of work that will come from that analysis because frankly, if I were, still in my private sector job and I had that report in front of me, it would be quite confusing about exactly what to do with regard to disclosing my activities on the SDGs. So, more to come in that space, but highly important, and I think it could have implications for standard setting work going on down the road.
Thank you very much, Tim. Does anybody have any kind of final words or questions for Tim in the next minute or two? Hearing none, I think, Tim, I will simply say thank you very much once again for making yourself available. This is obviously not the most ideal sort of way of doing it, but you have all of our best wishes on all of the work that you're doing in New York this week, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation in the future.
Thank you very much, and I appreciated the time and the conversation. I'd be happy to follow up with any additional questions or discussion that GSSB members would like to have.
Great.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so the next item in our agenda, we're very pleased to welcome a guest. Wim Bartels has been a friend of GRI for quite a long time, and it's very nice of you to come and make yourself available for this discussion. He is a member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and we have a discussion right now about that work and the kind of how we might coordinate with the standards development. Wim, I'd like to simply open it up to you to introduce yourself and then to take us through your presentation as you like.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you for inviting us here. As the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. As we discussed in preparation, I have prepared a couple of slides to introduce you, maybe again, but into the work of the TCFD and then link it to what it could mean for the GRI. Apart from my role at the TCFD that started early 2016, I am a partner with KPMG, as you call it, a friend for a long time of GRI, as we took the journey, I think, a bit together since 2003 when I joined the KPMG Sustainability, and I worked on sustainability reporting and assurance since. So that's, I think, a very brief introduction of myself. The slides, I'm just checking. Here we are. So let me give you about maybe 15, 20 minutes introduction about the work from the start to where we are so that you have the full overview and then open it up for any discussion you want to have or questions or points to raise. So first of all, getting back to the installment of the TCFD, it all started with the Financial Stability Board getting concerned about the stability of the financial system when looking at climate-related risks. And looking into the potential consequences, the FSB decided to take an initiative to better address these risks, and then realized there is no real good reporting on climate-related risk, and therefore we need a task force to develop a disclosure framework that companies and financial institutions, and I'll come to that, can use in better explaining the risk and opportunities that they might face. From here onwards, whenever I say risks, I also mean opportunities, but I know that it's sometimes a bit confusing and a bit long to say opportunities all the time. So whenever I say risk, it also deliberately also opportunities. So the task force was established in 2015, chaired by Michael Bloomberg, and as you, for those of you who are in the room, can see on screen, to promote more informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions, and to enable also better understanding of the concentrations of carbon-related assets in the financial sector. And you can imagine if you are an investor and you would nowadays only invest in certain industries such as the energy sector, you might run a significant risk as an institution, but it might have its implications for the financial system. Since early 2016, we worked on developing the recommendations, resulting in a final report in July this year, presented to the G20, which called, as you see on the left side, recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I'll explain you in a second what the key recommendations are. In addition, we have issued guidance, deliberately guidance, I'll come back to that, called Implementing the Recommendations of the TCFD, and Scenario Analysis. And also for Scenario Analysis, I'll specifically come back on that. That is quite a new area, I think, for all of us, and good to understand what that could mean. What is important, I think, to realize is that this is really about financial impact. So whenever I talk on the TCFD, I say to the audience, and also therefore here, this is not about the impact of a company on the environment. It is about the impact of the environment on a company, and more specifically, the financial impact on companies. I think it's quite important to realize that and take that from the beginning. Specifically, I should say here at the GRI, given your focus on wider stakeholders and the impact of companies as well. So important to take as a basis for our further discussion. We then, as you can see on screen, identified a number of risks and a number of opportunities and categorized them. I won't go through them in all detail, but I think on the risk side, it is relevant to distinguish between the physical and the transition risk. So on the one hand, companies run the risk of not being sufficiently ready or sufficiently quick in changing their business and or business model, and therefore could run risks of discontinuity on the short, medium or long term. The TCFD have always looked at those three terms, deliberately also the long term, as you can imagine. And transition risks are the major ones that we discussed, given, well, you know, the current business model of some sectors, and I'll name a few again in a few minutes. Then on the other hand, we have the physical risks, weather patterns on the longer term, but extreme weather and weather incidents on the short term, and unfortunately, we are already experiencing them increasingly, I think, these years. These risks and opportunities can have financial impact on companies, and therefore would, in the end, demonstrate themselves either in the income statement or in the balance sheet. And that is where the task force in all their work focused on what could be the potential impact of any development on the income, the cash flow, or the balance sheet. Talking about climate-related risk and opportunities, we developed for each of the categories a list of examples, potential risks and opportunities that companies could face. Again, I won't go through them, but just to show you that there's quite an extensive list that all here, as addressed here, all relate to this can impact, in the end, the financial value or the financial results of the company. It relates to sometimes new markets, renewable energy, we can all think of. It sometimes relates to risks for current markets, if we think, for example, about the automotive industry that might face issues when they don't transition sufficiently quickly to, for example, electrical vehicles, to name just one, or work further on energy efficiency and think about their diesel cars. So that's just an example. And again, as you see here on the left side, physical and transition risk, and quite a complete list of risk and opportunities that companies can take as a basis for their assessment of their own situation in this regard. And I should have moved the slide, sorry for that, but this is the overview of the risk and opportunities. with the different categories as I just described. Then moving on to the overall recommendations. And they are essentially 11 quite straightforward recommendations, I could say. And when discussing these, we first of all are realizing that we develop a voluntary framework, and we were deliberately asked not to develop the next reporting framework. So it wasn't our intent to develop new metrics, new disclosures, new guidelines, because we have so many already. We identified, I think, about 400 in the end. And that includes, of course, GRI standards as they are nowadays. And it was deliberately intended to build on everything that already existed. That means for the TCFD that we have come up with a more principle-based framework, also to leave room for companies to make their own decisions within that framework, and to make it to keep it focused in order to make it workable, so to call it. In looking at the risk and opportunities, we came to the 4 categories that you again see here on screen: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And it has a kind of a logical flow. When thinking about climate-related risk and opportunities, it all starts with the consideration of the board and senior manager of those risks. If they haven't considered risk and opportunities from the investor's perspective, that might be a sign to become cautious or to engage with the company in case you believe that these risks could be relevant for that company, and therefore to discuss this first aspect of governance. So that's the first part. Then we move into strategy, as the category is called, but it is about first of all, identifying the risk and opportunities that a company faces. And here, as I already said, deliberately the short, medium, and long term. We all know in this room that climate-related risk can appear on the long term. The statement of Mr. Carney, the chairman of the Financial Stability Board, was back in 2015 that as they are long-term risks, but they can have significant impacts, by the time they appear, business might be too late to still act. And that's why already now companies have to consider the long-term risks for investors and the financial system. We requested a description of those risks and opportunities from companies, with subsequently the impact of those risks and opportunities on the company strategy and financial planning. And you can imagine that, for example, if you are in the oil and gas industry, to stick to the energy sector, if you would invest in your next operation, that is a long-term investment, and therefore, if you consider climate change as a key risk for your company, you might consider to allocate your investments differently, and that would be the impact on your financial planning, as an example. That's what you see here on the strategy B. And then on the C, that's the most new recommendation, I think, the most innovative as we see it ourselves. That is a call for scenario analysis to assess the resilience of the organization's strategy. It means that companies are requested to take their current business model, markets, and everything that is relevant for their financial performance, and look at the future, considering several scenarios, several climate scenarios, I should say. One of them, as you'll see in the recommendations, being a 2-degree scenario. And we have set the 2-degree scenario as a kind of a reference scenario for obvious reasons. Maybe the Paris Agreement regards the 2-degree temperature increase. And with that, investors and ultimately central banks could build a more or less comparable picture of potential future states of companies. There's 2-degree scenarios, obviously only one scenario. And if you're in, for example, the insurance industry, you could imagine that a 4.5-degree scenario could be as relevant, given that you might have a significantly increased payout of damage to insured companies. And therefore, it is up to companies to decide about scenarios, but then to express what they think could be the potential consequences of those scenarios for the business and the financial results. I should say here, I think that this is not about predictions or forecasts or expectations, it's really scenarios. Just a side note, at this very moment, this is all really new for most of the companies. Some oil and gas companies have developed scenarios, quantitative scenarios. All the rest are really, I think, more or less in the phase of considering what qualitative scenarios could be and how you would at all define them. After strategy, so after having defined your risk and opportunities and the resilience of your company going forward, the other aspect is the real embedding in your company, and that's where risk management comes in. Being requested to disclose how climate-related risks have been embedded in your risk management processes and system. And I think simply for here, I'll leave it to that. But I think, it sounds quite logical. And then the last category is metrics and targets. Metrics and targets, not defined apart from carbon emissions. A lot of debate about carbon emissions, whether that should be a separate recommendation. The reason for that relates to investment portfolios. The question of carbon concentration in portfolios is a relevant one, and therefore to allow investors to express, if you like, or report their portfolios in terms of carbon intensity, this is a separate recommendation within the overall set of recommendations. For all the others, we have just suggested, as you'll see, disclose the metrics you use to assess the risk and opportunities in line with your strategy and risk management processes. And that links back to the risk and opportunities that companies would have identified. And here we ask for the relevant metrics to monitor the level and progress of these risks. With that, related targets as well, in order to know where companies are aiming to go. These are 11, I think, in a way, quite straightforward, simple recommendations, deliberately meant to be so simple and straightforward. Still, implementation, where we are now, quite challenging. Moving forward then to where should this all be reported, and what about materiality, and maybe also relevant in the context of your standards and the discussions you're having. First of all, again, linking it back to financial impact, the TCFD is looking at financial materiality. Not looking necessarily at materiality for certain stakeholders, for certain locations because of the location of operation itself, but really the financial materiality. For two of them, we decided to request reporting regardless of materiality, being governance and risk management. Why? Because we see that as the fundament for investors to understand whether companies are considering risk and opportunities at all, and whether they are following the right procedures or install the right processes. So that's why we haven't set a materiality threshold for those two recommendations, but for the other strategy, metrics and targets, we recommend companies to report on it, taking into account the materiality threshold. As you can see, for organizations in the 4 non-financial groups, and you may wonder what are the 4 non-financial groups, I'll come to that, with more than $1 billion US dollar equivalent in revenue, we suggest to still disclose information on strategy and metrics and targets, even if they don't see it as material at this moment. The reason is that these might become material in further future, and it could be relevant for investors to still understand it. So not in financial filings, but in other reports, such as sustainability reports. For the key material information and governance and risk management, we request or recommend disclosure in financial filings, so the regular annual reporting. A little more on the structure, the recommendations, I explained them. In addition, we have developed guidance, and I should say, maybe again, and emphasize that this is guidance. It's not further recommendations. It's not to further to put forward further requirements. It's really additional information that companies can use to their benefit. That applies to guidance for certain sectors. I'll explain them in a second, and guidance for all sectors for each of the recommendations. Then supplemental guidance. Quite important in my view. We have developed the recommendations such that they are applicable for all sectors, all countries, all sizes. But we believe that we should provide a little more guidance for certain sectors. First of all, on the one hand, financial industries, certain financial industries, you'll see them on screen, banks, insurance, asset managers, asset owners. These are the key players in the financial industry that drive financial system risk that we are talking about eventually. And therefore, understanding how their portfolios are prone to climate-related risk or opportunities is quite important. But on the other hand, we identified 4 non-financial groups. And again, you see them: energy, transportation, materials and buildings, and agriculture, food and forest. It was assessed by the task force that these groups of companies might be the most vulnerable for climate change in financial terms again, and therefore they would be helped with additional guidance. We deliberately call these groups, not sectors, because we don't want to limit companies into certain sectors and suggest that only these sectors should have to report, but really say if you are related to energy, if you are a supplier of the energy sector, you might face the similar risk as the energy companies themselves, and therefore you would still fall under that group and be able to use that guidance. 2 more introductory remarks from my side. One, the link to non-financial frameworks. This is, of course, what you all have been waiting for all the time. Where is the link to GRI? As I said in the beginning, we were specifically requested not to develop the next reporting framework. So everything we did was describe disclosures as I showed them before, and then as much as we could connect them with current reporting frameworks. We intended to develop financial metrics as we were looking and are looking at financial impact, but realized that during our conversations that many metrics that inform financial risk are actually non-financial metrics, or some call it nowadays pre-financial metrics. And that will sound very familiar to you, I think. Here I'm just taking a snapshot that talks about energy and water, but as we all know, I think the level of water consumption can be an indicator of financial risk if you would not be able to withdraw water from your environment to produce your products. So therefore, we defined, or we selected, I must say, a number of example metrics. Again, I should stipulate that I think example metrics, not to direct companies that they should use these metrics or should report, but they can use them. And if they do, we encourage them to link it, align it with already existing metrics in other frameworks. And one of them, as you see here, is GRI. So it refers to GRI 302.5, for example, where it is about expenditures for low carbon initiatives. The one other point I just want to explain here, is that we, for each of these non-financial indicators, we included a rationale for inclusion to make or at least attempt to make a link between the non-financial indicator and the potential financial implications to make it financially relevant again. This is a sign that we should leave the room, I guess, or does it stop?
There's an alarm that we've just heard in the building here, and I think we're just going to check the nature of it because it's stopped now. Wim, as it has stopped, shall we just assume that you can carry on until it starts up again? Okay.
Okay, we got the sign to carry on. Final remark is on scenario analysis. Just to clarify that a little, I think already explained what the intent is of including that recommendation. Task force also specifically looked at future-oriented information. That might sound again quite logical, but most of the information that companies report to date is backward-looking. But this is not very helpful if we're looking at risk and opportunities on the shorter and medium and long term. So with that, we introduced scenario analysis and look with a scenario analysis at the resilience of the strategy. So it's in a way an analysis to test whether your business would be resilient under certain climate scenarios. And just as a last remark, we're talking all the time about disclosures, but in the end, this is about managing and reducing a risk or creating opportunities. So we, as the task force, also see the relevance of specifically of scenario analysis, but also, for example, assessing risk and opportunities to strengthen the business and the business resilience through disclosures. But that's just a last remark from my side. I don't know where we are exactly on time, but I would like to thank you for now and open up for any questions, remarks, discussion you want to have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wim. I've got Kent Swift to begin with.
Yeah, I have just a couple of questions. They're sort of the same questions I would have for SASB. Is, you're talking sort of directly to companies about financial financial related disclosures, but ultimately regulators are the ones that determine what's required. And to what extent do you sort of educate, regulators? I'm American, so I think of the SEC, regulators about these kinds of disclosures. They may not be very knowledgeable. That is, the kinds of disclosures that the SEC has recommended are, they're not very detailed. So is there an effort to educate standard setters and regulators, and also what's the reception been? That is, I don't have the sense that the SEC has been very receptive to the SASB, for instance, and I'm just wondering, about this initiative, whether some of these regulators are responsive to what you're doing.
A couple of comments, responses. First, it is a voluntary framework, as I think already said, industry-led. With that, we did not connect with the regulators in the process in terms of getting their input or their buy-in. Having said that, it has been received and welcomed by the FSB, which represents the G20 ministers of finance and central banks. That's to suggest that there is an expectation in a way that this will become part of regulation in future. But it wasn't the remit. Asking for our regulators, I come back to the connection question, our regulators considering this. I just read today that France is promoting, the French government is promoting to make the TCFD recommendations mandatory. So that's the first sign that regulators apparently are looking into this and wanting to mandate this. We, as part of our overall effort, back to your question, we are connecting with regulators, informing or educating them, as you say. I don't have a specific comment on the SEC just because I'm not aware. We haven't heard, I must say, negative feedback. That's the first positive sign, maybe. We also haven't yet, apart from France, as today, as it's the climate week in Climate Action Week in New York. There is not yet. There are not yet regulators who said we're going to mandate this. But I know, for example, that the EU, who have issued the EU Non-Financial Information Directive, have also waited for the TCFD recommendations before they issued their guidance, as they wanted to refer to it as applicable. All to say that there are first steps, I would say. Again, the TCFD is not bound, not mandated to reach out to all regulators and try and educate or convince them. But definitely we are connecting with relevant NGOs, standard setters, frameworks as yourselves, and are also, as part of that, connecting with regulators to inform them.
Daniel.
Daniel Ingram, thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'm actually now sort of conference season, so I went to conference last week in San Diego, Council of Institutional Investors, and then next week's the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, and you know, this is certainly sort of on the agenda for the investment community. And I was just kind of wondering, so there's been a lot of discussion about so your initial sort of 4 different areas, the degree to which they are applicable for the financial industries and for the non-financial groups. In that I think investors sort of started this off thinking this is about companies sort of managing the risks and, you know, in combination with some standardization around the disclosures. Then it's come back to sort of investors, and then there's now sort of a focus on these 4 different types of investors. And I think there's an expectation that, say, for example, you know, we've got these 4 different financial industries that you've identified playing different parts in the investment chain. And I think there are those who are at the end of the investment chain, the sort of end providers of capital, like the asset owners, who are quite nervous around the sort of potential requirements on them looking very similar to the potential requirements for the companies. Mm-hmm. And so I just wondered whether you've sort of given any thought how that might play out in terms of the guidance later on, as well as the conversations now.
Yeah, well, a couple of points. I think the first is the guidance for financial sectors is different from the non-financial sectors. The key difference being that for the financial sectors, we suggest certain disclosures for their portfolios rather than their own individual operations. Whereas for companies, you know, we would really focus on their operations. So for investors, we look at the portfolio level, and we have suggested, for example, to provide information back to that carbon emissions recommendations on the carbon intensity of their portfolio. So that's a specific recommendation for the financial sectors, not for the non-financial sectors. If non-financial companies would report, for example, on water scarcity in certain areas, we expect that wouldn't be possible for investors, as they will have portfolios in many industries. So how do you add this all up? And that's why so far we focus on carbon intensity. If you ask for what will it mean for the financial industry? Maybe going back to the objective. In the end, this was all started because of the potential risk to the stability of the financial system. So in that regard, it are the financial sectors that need to report in order to be able to do something at the system level. If we look in the investment chain, as you said, it all starts with the companies with the more detailed information, which will then reflect on the reporting by the financial industry. Will they be recommended to report, let's say, equal to non-financial sectors? In a way, yes. They are not excluded from any of the four sectors. If you are an investor and you don't care about the carbon intensity of your portfolio, that's a risk for the ones behind the investor, which are the ultimate beneficiaries, for example, for a pension fund. So also for a financial institution, you would be interested in the governance and in the risk management, right? So do you consider climate-related risk in your portfolio management is a key question. Then what are the risks? Well, you would need to understand what is the composition of my portfolio, and what does that mean for the risk and opportunities within that portfolio. If I have quite heavy investments in automotive, that's a certain risk. If I have a heavy investments in agriculture, that's a similar risk, but it's in other parts of the supply chain. So just to say, well, a long story maybe to say, yes, they are requested to do similar things as non-financials. In terms of timing, it will start with the non-financials before the financials can really do something about their reporting. Is again expectation.
Michel.
Okay, my name is Michel Wascher. I represent More the Business here. And as a reporter and a sustainability professional, I first wanted to comment on the quality of the work of the TCFD, in my opinion. Those are very good documents, very easy to read, and the recommendations are, in my opinion, very difficult to dispute. I'm not saying that it's going to be very easy to align to all the recommendations and that it's not triggering internal discussions within companies on what to disclose, what to put in place, and so on. But still, because of the quality of the work, we expect it to become a major influence in reporting. Whether it becomes mandatory or not is a bit of a non-issue for us, because if investors' pressure is there, well, regulations are national, investors' pressure is international. Our chief executive officer has already agreed to do so, so it's going to be the case anyway. But still, we expect that to be a major influence in future standards and also for rating agencies.
Good to see you again, and probably glad you are not back home or in South Africa with KPMG right now. The question is really, if we look at, and we've heard Tim earlier this afternoon, sustainability reporting is to drive sustainability at the end of the day. And I'm fully supportive of the initiative on climate change disclosures. But do you think there will be an uptake really to drive change in the world to be better geared for sustainability?
I think we should split two, how would I say, two maybe ways of thinking or attitude. On the one hand, to your question, in this is a very personal view, by the way, but my personal view is that this will drive change significantly. The moment investors start to understand that they might run a risk in their investments, and companies equally, they start to act because it can impact the financial results of companies and the value of companies, and that is driving well, much of our world today, I would say. Implicitly, we will see moves towards sustainable development with that. If you ask, like, will this change the world or in companies towards sustainable development, my first answer would be yes. Now we start to connect sustainable developments to financials. Suddenly everyone gets interested and says, oh wow, this can mean my company will might even go bankrupt. So in that regard it will. On the other hand, I don't think we should be over optimistic in terms of that. Now also with that everyone will call it try and save the world, right? This is not about, and say that it is bluntly, but this is not about saving the world. So this is about financial stability, about financial economy, about financial investments, not about the wider impact. Might some investors call it see the light and realize that there's more to gain in this world or to protect in the world? Hopefully yes, but I would split the two, and on the one I'm very positive, on the other there's a bit of hope. Let's put it like that.
I promise to be brief because I know very little about climate change, and I pay attention to your presentation because I want to start to work with risks to the business due to social aspects. So you are saying that the climate change could guide a change on the view of some investors in terms of preventing financial risks, right, due to climate change. Are you seeing in any case the same approach to social aspects or resilience to cope with environmental events or spills or something like that?
Directly, no. I mean to say with that, I don't see, apart from the responsible investors, we should park them, of course, but for the mainstream, in my view, climate is now the issue that also the mainstream investors start to realize. Under climate change or related to climate change are social issues such as migration, for example, or conflicts within, but that's a kind of always linked to climate change. As a separate topic, I don't see yet the same approach, and I think the reason behind is, again, if we link it to what investors are looking for, is the financial value of their investments. And the link between social issues and financial impact has not yet been made so clearly as we have, well, attempted it now for climate change.
Well, in terms, when you're talking about climate change, as I said, I know very little, but in terms of environmental impacts of events, we do have a situation in Brazil where a mining company caused a huge accident, and now the impact on the return on investment of their shareholders is huge. We are talking about something like $155 million to begin with, to compensate and to remediate social effects of this disaster. So I was wondering if there any initiative in the world that is coping with this type of consequence to business, because it seems very, very similar to this one.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm not aware of that, and I recognize your point, of course, of financial damage because of environmental incidents or accidents. When I made my previous remark, that was taking it as a widely spread initiative, and that's what I'm not aware of. So there are definitely cases, but is that a development or a movement amongst investors? To my knowledge, it isn't. There may be other views, but to my knowledge, it isn't. But it is a next issue.
Yeah, you'd mentioned measuring carbon intensity. I'm very interested in carbon intensity. So, and I've pulled up your website with the documents that you've created. Do you have actual, do you show calculations for carbon intensity? Do you recommend specific calculations for it?
Yeah, there has been quite some feedback in the consultation from investors about the different methodologies, and we, in the end, we decided to provide additional guidance with the calculations as you suggest, and we refer to one of the methodologies. Forgive me that I don't know the exact name of it now, but one of the methodologies to be applied. That was the one that was most commonly agreed with by the investors. But apparently there are different ways to calculate the carbon intensity, and we included them in the guidance for reference for investors.
Good, I'll take a look at those. Thank you.
Wim, we have on the GSSB, I mean, we have a number of ways in which we might be taking account of the work that the TCFD has done as we think about how to inform the development of the GRI standards. There's several different things that we could be looking at from our, we have a strategy disclosure that asks for financial risks and other impacts related to climate change. We have topic-specific standards that there may be some reason to, kind of look at specifically. There's a sector specificity to the TCFD approach, which is a very important thing on our work plan. We've also got the possibility to think about how we sort of explain the link between our disclosure standard, our reporting standards, and this work that you've done. If you were on GSSB, how would you want us to be thinking about what to do next?
I did not prepare for that question, Judy. So let me talk and think, or maybe think and talk if I do it the right way. The first that comes to my mind is this development, the TCFD, I mean, is too important to ignore. I'm talking from the GSB perspective. So I'm not trying to promote the TCFD. Just, seeing what is happening, the government that I just referred to, the companies that are endorsing, the ones that have said yesterday we're gonna implement it. It's too big to ignore. I think that's one. The second is this is the first, but in my view not the last connection that is being made between sustainability and financial impact, and that is a most relevant connection for the matter of change, as you asked about, and for the matter of really driving sustainable development in the end, and making a more integrated approach to value in the end. So I think in that regard, this aligns with the GRI's objectives, I would say. If then I would say, so what should we do? In my view, identifying potential gaps between, I'm thinking what comes first, identifying potential gaps between the current standards and the TCFD recommendations, and considering whether those gaps should be closed by the standards, I think could be a very valuable step. What is the benefit for GRI, I think, is a key question. In my view, that comes back to linking sustainable development also to the financial world, not only, but also. It will help the ones that are working on sustainability within companies. It will help the sustainability professionals to say GRI is not about society and CSR, and it's also about financial impact. By the way, we have more stakeholders to serve, and GRI addresses that as well. So I think it benefits all parties involved in GRI. Then the other question or point I'd have is linking GSSB to TCFD will also strengthen, in my view, GRI's positioning, and maybe a bit linked to the previous comment I made, but I think just demonstrating that you are also caring about financial risk, as you said, it is in the standards. But I think that if you ask the average, outsider or user, what is GRI about? I don't think they think about financial risk, right? They think about, stakeholder impact, something like that. So I think it will strengthen the positioning, which content-wise is already part of the standards. Does that at least a little give you an idea?
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
And as I say, I mean, it gives us plenty to think about, because there are numerous different routes for us to sort of consider what the impact might be on the standards next. Did you have any further questions from the standards division side?
Well, no, maybe just feedback on what we are seeing. You did allude to the fact that this work was set out from the beginning as not replacing existing reporting frameworks, but it is subsumed in the bigger discussion of reporting burden, for sure, and we have that feedback. So what we're facing just from a user perspective is, I think, also was the increased, I think, promotion of the TCFD, of the final recommendations, that they come to us and say, so how does it fit? Where does the TCFD state really that this is not a separate request next to all these other things? Is there some kind of understanding beyond the linkage that it is probably opportune, at least for the moment, to disclose these kind of subject matters in non-financial reports, because very many organizations struggle with including it, although it's the distant goal, and I think we have a lot in common there. That eventually the hope is that reports of companies include sustainability and financial matters as one. I think that's a distant goal right now, but very real for this discussion here. Our practitioners come increasingly back to us with the question, so what's the intermediate step? And is there a joint effort of the TCFD and GRI to explain that matter?
Right, yeah, and I think that point you make of including it in non-financial reports or sustainability reports is one that has also been discussed within the TCFD. We, as I shared earlier, suggest to include it in annual report, because that's the, call it, investors space. So that's where it should be. But I think it's fair to acknowledge that for many companies that will be challenging, specifically in the first 1 to 2 years, and I know from my own experience at KPMG that the moment information gets into the annual report, it gets a completely different dynamic, right? So where you have some freedom to, well, call it to explore, to take a journey in a sustainability reporting environment. That's not the case in annual reporting. And if you take specific jurisdictions, such as the US, it even becomes immediately a legal issue. So would you then report on your climate-related risk and you would miss one? That could have severe legal implications. So in that regard, companies who decide to start in their non-financial report, or maybe, and that might be the best journey to take, is to include in the annual report a kind of high-level information on this is how we look at this is how we discuss it, this is the process we are following, and further details in the non-financial report. We're not recommending it, but it could be the journey that some companies, or many companies maybe, will be taking. Yes.
Maybe just as immediate, what you are outlining is the kind of response, if that was in the public domain, also from the TCFD, I think that would be very helpful for practitioners at this stage, because there are certain legal contexts in which multinationals are operating where they see the risk that you are describing, moving from no disclosure to disclosure where they're not certain that it is complete. At the same time, most of these companies have already non-financial reports in place, and they're struggling with that bigger question anyways, and guidance on how they can start to develop this practice, maybe with that goal of integrating it in annual reporting and using established standards. That seems to be the space that our stakeholders right now, they're pointing to us to help with this exercise.
Right, yeah, and maybe in addition to that, well, you know, we, as TCFD, you can imagine we don't want to complicate or blur, right? So keep clear on it should be an annual report. I think it's also good to mention that including it in the non-financial report, as you suggest, without anything in the annual report might be a risk as well from a legal perspective, right? Omitting the information at all is maybe as risky as taking a stepwise approach.
Yeah, and that's exactly the bigger ticket item that I think all leaders in sustainability reporting are. Can they actually continue to have two reporting processes where they point on the one hand to material issues that are financial and then other issues that are highly relevant, and how can they explain their way out when people start to ask the question, so why is it not in one report?
Right,
And I think that drives the integration anyways, but for this particular issue, it's very real and much more real than many of the social or environmental impacts of organizations that we have also covered in the standards. Yeah,
and to your point of the TCFD unintentionally setting a kind of a new framework. I think it's also good to mention that one of the steps that the TCFD will be taking is look for alignment opportunities with, you know, GRI and CDSB and CDP, everyone that has carbon-related information in their frameworks, to align those so that companies that will report against any of these frameworks will also, with that, report to the TCFD requests at the same time.
Attila, did you want to? Okay, it's resolved. Okay. Robin.
Thanks, Lynn. I just had a quick observation or a question to confirm. With the 2-degree scenario piece, it sort of strikes me that that's a logical place where, given that is sort of a science-based and global agreement, that's an area where there is that confluence between impact and the financial risk. So is that, do you think, would it be correct to say that that's the area where the frameworks kind of intersect, or there would be meaningful information for both coming out of that 2-degree exercise for a company?
To an extent, yes, but so if a company would say, for example, you know, and take emissions for the moment as the indicator, would say, well, in a 2-degree world, we would have essentially moved to zero, right, in 2050. This is how we're going to do it. Then it's perfectly aligned. The impact and financial risk are aligned. But I should first of all say, then it's still a scenario. It's not necessarily where companies are aiming for. They could say, well, in this scenario, this would happen. But it's not to say they're going to do it. But let's assume they do it. Then it's, I think, perfectly aligned. But it could still mean that companies decide to take other directions. So they won't necessarily have to say, so that means we all move to zero. You know, they could also take different decisions. Then we go into other business. Then we focus ourselves on a certain market where, you know, the Paris Agreement is not signed or, you know, will not be implemented. We have some countries that decide that or just consider that. So, you know, there could still be different decisions and still under scenarios. So, yeah, it is a could, but not necessarily a should, I think. Yeah.
Stian.
Wim, in the discussions that you had, it's obviously focused on climate change and mostly around 2 degrees and carbon. But there are many other factors, water being one, food security, human rights, etc. Have you considered those impacts, or is it part of the overall risk materiality assessment?
Right. Well, it's part of materiality assessment. The overview of risk and opportunities, and the overall terminology talks about climate-related risk and opportunities. So definitely much wider than carbon. Water is the first kind of logical one that you don't start looking to, but as I just suggested, it can also be social one. So it can be, you say, in a 2-degree world, this area, first of all, runs out of water. That means, or that could be a scenario, let's put it like that, that the population moves out of that area. If that is one of your key markets, that could have, of course, significant impacts, and that could be a financial climate-related risk that you would like to consider and report upon. I was talking to Unilever the other day, and they suggested, or they shared that in Sao Paulo there was a shortage of water. I think it was 2015, if I'm correct. Yeah. Unilever sells detergents that need water, so they immediately had a decrease in sales, obviously in that one area. That could be, I mean, this was not really material for them, but financially, but this could be such a consideration. Well, if in certain cities or part of the world we run out of water, then I can sell my products, which means either I'm going to develop new products that don't need water, which they have, by the way, or we're going to move to other markets, or we're going to step into other products because detergents is no longer viable on the long run. So it's really everything related to climate. The one consideration maybe or limitation to your point, does it include things like human rights? It could be, but the link between those developments and financial impact or financial materiality is always the key point to consider, and that becomes sometimes a bit remote.
Okay, thank you. I've got Kirsten and we've got Daniel down the line who'd like to raise a question. We've got about 1 minute left on this, so why don't we take both of the questions, and then Wim, if you could probably wrap up a response in one, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, back to the scenario analysis. I'm glad that you mentioned for the 4.5 degree scenario also, Wim, because that might, in many cases, be more dramatic than the 2 degree scenario. When we're talking about physical risks, for instance, it's the 4.5 or even the 6 degrees scenario that should really be evaluated, and it's very important that the TCFD opens up for such different scenarios. And I think that's much of the value in the TCFD, that it's not rules-based, it's based on actual needs for the reporting organization to disclose the risks related to that organization. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Daniel?
Yes, hi. Sorry, I'm in a public place and I was out of the conversation for a few minutes, so maybe you already addressed this issue, but it's a fascinating topic, and my question relates to, in a future scenario of 2 degrees or 4 or 6 or whatever it is we're talking about, we're certainly not going to get rid of, for example, fossil fuels. So if you're British Petroleum, and in the context of your discussion, your future is either, I don't know, 100% renewables or 50% renewables or 25% renewables. We're not envisioning a world that's necessarily gotten rid of fossil fuels. So is that somehow weighted in risk analysis, and how do you approach the reality that we are not totally getting rid of some of the most contaminating industries, and how do we treat that as risk? I mean, I'm not sure if my question is clear.
Yeah, maybe, and I should suggest a few final remarks. First of all, the scenarios that companies select, for example, a 4.5 degree, as Kirsten, you suggested, tells investors in itself something about the views and the considerations of the company. So I can't agree more with what you just said, and that is exactly what the TCFD is looking for. And the selection of scenarios again it tells, gives information in itself. Let's put it like that. In terms of the future of fossil fuels or renewable energy, we have included in the scenario analysis guidance a couple of potential scenarios that you could use the IEA scenarios for example, and they do include certain developments in fossil fuels. It's not that all scenarios go to 100% renewable. So yeah, with that it is part of that, but we suggest in a way companies to use external scenarios specifically for energy that are already developed, as it will be quite challenging to develop global future energy scenarios yourself as a company. So better use all the work that has been done by scientists and international agencies. With that final remark, thank you very much for inviting us again, and hope it was a valuable conversation.
Thank you very much, Wim. As I said, you've given us a lot to think about, and we look forward to thinking about what some of the specific next steps might be, and to keeping in touch with your work as time goes on. We are going to take a short break now and come back at 4 o'clock promptly to begin the live cast again. So thank you very much, and we will go silent for a little bit now.